This is great. So really excited for the conversation today. I've got with me a new friend and someone who I really feel like is doing some amazing things in the sales and sales technology world. And I'm excited to introduce her and for us to talk about modern playbooks. So we've got like a quick walkthrough for all of you. I know your next question, Jake, is this going to be recorded? Yes, of course it will be recorded. It'd be kind of silly if we didn't record it, right? At the end of the day. But yes, it will be recorded. It doesn't mean leave, stay and ask questions and be selfish, everybody. But we're going to talk a lot about how organizations are thriving today with this concept that we've known for a long time called the sales playbook, right? The concept of the sales playbook has been around for quite some time. And so today, Melanie and I are going to really kind of dive into it. So without further ado, we've got more people showing up. We've got like a few hundred. Yeah, this is good. All right, so we've got a good crew of people showing up. I'm going to share my screen as well, so all of you will be able to see that. All right, so let's jump into it. All right. Cool. So we're going to talk about what goes into a great playbook. This is actually a two-parter, right? You don't get that these days. A two-part kind of series over the next month that we're going to do, talking about what great looks like. And make sure all of you tune in June 28th at 12:30 Central, 1:30 Eastern, where we are going to talk about adoption. Which we're going to talk about adoption today, but we're going to go deep because at the end of the day, too many people focus on the big rollout and on gathering all the information, and then 6 months in, they're like, "Why aren't people using the playbook?" It's like, well, there's a lot of reasons why. So if you're on LinkedIn, somehow you already found my channel, so you already know who I am. I'm Jake Dunlap. I'm the CEO of Skaled Consulting. We are a 45 plus person global consulting firm. We specialize in helping organizations optimize both their sales processes and its intersection with technology, which is what leads me to my friend Melanie. So Melanie, why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. Appreciate it. I'm Melanie, co-founder and CEO of Speckit. Speckit is a just-in-time training solution really designed to make it easier than ever for your reps and success agents and more to find the information they need at their fingertips in whatever workflow they're in, whether they're prospecting in LinkedIn, doing their pipeline management, and Clary or Salesforce, you name it. And so super excited to be here today. We work with a lot of different go-to-market teams that are trying to figure out this exact problem, right? How do we codify what we do here on the go-to-market side in a variety of formats? I think everyone has their own definition of what a good sales playbook looks like. And so it's been a pleasure, getting to know Jake and the rest of the Skaled team, just seeing, what best in class looks like. So should be a really fun conversation and excited to participate.
There you go. We gave you the play-by-play, right? So
you there you go. Yeah,
as well too. Right?
We just raised $45 million back in December, Series B. Very proud of the progress, and it's been a fun journey. And I think the coolest thing, more than anything, about the world that we're in, just-in-time learning, training, Jake's world as well, is just seeing how many different companies are trying to figure this out, right? Whether that's companies at scale like the Snowflakes and more of the world, or whether that's like high growth SMB customers. Like the reality is everyone's trying to figure out, like, how do we make our reps more effective, more efficient, and ultimately how do we make sure that there's consistency across the board? So these are some of the customers we have the pleasure of helping out, and excited to see that list grow.
Yes, love it. And there's a lot of like co companies where we're conspiring as well too. So in a good way to help people again solve some of this problem. So I'll tell you this, like sales playbook, I think, for example, with a lot of people, we thought it would be important to just kind of level set on the definitions, right? That again, the goal of a playbook is to capture best practices in communications, right? Obviously. Help people to understand what to do. So there's kind of a combination of how I show up in that situation, and then like what are the tasks or outcomes that should happen. And I'll add to that too, it's also things that help me to understand, what's expected of me, my KPIs, et cetera. So it really should be that place, like this place I can go to, not just for my onboarding, but also a place that I can go to, maybe before going to my leader, or, I can go to my leader still, but I can see, hey, what's the company line on this, to really understand what are best practices for how I should be managing my day, how I should be interacting with customers, and then maybe how I should be, taking care of forecasting and other kind of key KPIs. And Mel, I don't know if there's anything that you would add to that, but that's, for us, that's what we see as, kind of the core elements here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially now, one of the reasons it's so important is, whether you're looking at the market today and really the focus shifting from, hey, let's grow at all costs to, hey, let's make sure that the people that we have on staff are as efficient and effective as possible. Many of us went through massive hiring sprees and brought on some of the best hires from those companies that we admire. And those individuals might have the right soft skills, right? They might have already worked enterprise deals, worked commercial deals. They already know how to build that executive rapport. But what they don't know is like your way of doing things, right? Your sales processes, your objections, your way of proposing that value. And so I think it's so important to realize that if a company doesn't have a sales playbook and doesn't have that kind of like code of how to sell at enter your name, you're really not setting up those like top reps that you're so excited about for success. And so that's really where I see there's just a huge opportunity now. The companies have a little bit more breathing room, hopefully, to focus on that to really take a lot away from this.
Yeah, the analogy I always use, Mel, is I say, okay, let me ask you this. Would you ever hire a new engineer and be like, oh, you've written code before? Oh, yeah, just go write some code. But in sales, we're like, oh, well, yeah, you've been in sales, you've sold into cybersecurity or insert whatever. It's kind of crazy. Sales is really the only, in accounting, they have GAAP, right? And they have other finance best. Sales is one of those things where I think for whatever reason, we've told ourselves a story that it's not, more process, or that process isn't, just as important. And so, Mel, this is a stat. This is from a report that you all did. That again, a lot of people, aren't really happy, right, with like sales training or kind of how they're onboarded. Again, like what, how does that typically manifest?
Yeah. What was interesting is this was kind of the general stat, but actually we broke it down further, and we broke down like what components of onboarding and training led to this. And actually, I don't know if we included the stat here, but sales playbook, like lack of codified sales playbooks, was actually number 3 on the list of kind of training that they wish they had to make them more effective. And so I think it's more so just highlighting that like it's not just the benefits to the organization of having consistency. Like, hey, here's how we think about these different metrics, and here's how we think about close dates, and here's how we think about this data, so that you can actually forecast the business in the right way and have that consistency. Like your reps actually want that guidance, right? They want that map of like, hey, directionally here, where do I go? Rather than, just kind of that thrown in the fire kind of approach.
Exactly.
We've been focused, I think, over the last couple of years on hiring, but now it's retention, right? How do we make sure that those top hires that we have, like we are retaining them, we're continuing to make them successful? And the reality is many companies, especially if you're in the technology space, have a lot of repeat reps right now, right? And this stat right here is one that I think should be front and center for a lot of folks.
Yeah. And I think a lot of companies, again, obviously why, we kind of got connected as we started to have a lot of organizations coming to us and coming to you at the same time to try to solve a very similar type of problem here. And again, the playbook, as we kind of get into this, like more granular here of like, what does great look like? I think it's just important to kind of tee up the why, right? Because I think that's also, I see other companies that go the opposite. It's like, we got to have a playbook, we got to have it. And it's like, it just doesn't have, what we see when in a lot of those playbooks is what it ends up not having is like the tactical examples. It doesn't have those examples where reps are like, just like, tell me what to do. So again, the data, like for us, just shows 1, increase revenue, decrease ramp time. And again, I cannot tell you how many sales leaders this decrease ramp time is like metric 1 for them, where they're really trying to figure this out. And then, it's kind of interesting. I was actually on the phone with I will not mention the name of the company, but this company has thousands of employees, and it's a very successful publicly traded company now, previous unicorn. And, we were talking about this, and it's also, how do your reps coach, or how do your leaders coach to this to decrease ramp time, and how do you get your leaders involved with the playbook? And we'll talk about that more in our next session. But again, a good playbook should really do all of these things, right? And I know sometimes as sales leaders or salespeople, we may be, we're like, well, how do you prove it? Like, what's the ROI? Well, at the end of the day, like you should be able to track a lot of these metrics. But I do hear a lot of leaders, who are so focused on, okay, so if we codify this part of it, when are we going to see ROI? How are we going to see ROI? And it's not that you shouldn't try to see ROI, right? It's that instead you should think about which part of the playbook is going to help with which part of ROI, right? Not as opposed to like the holistic playbook. So I just think for a lot of people out there, that companies that are having longer ramp times, their win rate's not quite where they want to be, or their rep productivity, this company I was talking about this morning, what's their revenue forecast based off of? Headcount, right? Got to do the bottoms up, right? That's the only way to throw some more bodies at it, right? But a lot more people are like, well, what if we could just increase rep efficiency? And so Playbook is really the way to think about that, you know,
And I
for a
can
lot
tell
of
you right now
folks.
on that piece, like the rep efficiency standpoint, like we are VC backed by some of the great funds out there like Kraft and Felicis. And like the reality is, given the state of the economy, like rep efficiency, if it's not already what your CEO is talking about in your org, like you will start hearing it more and more. Like rep efficiency is one of those golden standard metrics that, you know, is going to be front and center for a lot of companies to look at. And I think that's really where sales playbooks can play a big
That's
role.
it. Yeah. Well, I just think for a long time, again, like the whole way you scale sales is to just hire more people, right? It's just like, how else are you going to do it? It's like hire more people. And trust me, like it's, you know, look, I did that when I hired 40 people in 1 year when I was at Glassdoor, and like, hey, we crushed it. We got to what, 1 million MRR in a year, right? So like it worked, but but it wasn't that efficient. And I, you know, in retrospect, you know, now having, you know, worked with, you know, hundreds, thousands of companies, there's just a lot better ways to do it. And again, to me, Playbook is just a big piece of that. And so this is another, you know, another kind of part from that survey. So Mel, talk a little bit about this, about, you know, we talked about why playbooks matter. You know, how do you think about like reps learning and what's most important and some of the things that go into it?
Well, I think that was really the number three, right? Learning my company's sales process. And I think the reason why that's important too is I think a lot of companies are still trying to figure out, you know, what good onboarding looks like,
Yeah.
right? Especially if you've been scaling over the last few years, you've added all these. I mean, if you look at like what the day-to-day life of a rep looks like today versus even 5 years ago, like even 5 years ago, Gong, Chorus, those kinds of technologies didn't exist, right? And so what the day-to-day life of a rep looks like is quite different. And so a lot of companies are still completely reimagining like what does onboarding look like? And frankly, it's based on a lot of hunches, right? It's really, really hard to actually measure and use data to inform like here's what we should actually be training on during the onboarding process. And so here, you know, we've been doing a lot of research around this to really get down to like what are reps saying they need the most during onboarding. And I think this number three here, learning my company sales process, was interesting that really came out at number three there, even more important than the industry and space. But what I think is most interesting there is like you can spend all the time you want talking about negotiation during onboarding, you're not going to get anywhere, right? And that's where the sales playbook piece comes in, right? It's all about, hey, when you're in that part of the sales process, where's that map? Where's that guidance that you're going to need to go along? And so I think that this is super relevant because, hey, it's clearly part of what it takes to make a rep successful, and they acknowledge it, but it's probably not the best thing to be covered in depth during onboarding, right? And so what does good look like? What does the format look like? How do we actually make that accessible to the rep is a lot of what, you know, I spend time thinking about.
Of course.
In a second.
Yeah. And I think, look, the other ones on here that I think, again, just calling out like the importance more than ever of learning your space, learning the product. You know, I think for what I see in a lot of sales and sales playbooks is like we've kind of overemphasized, like, you know, what's not on here, learning qualification criteria or medic. Oh, shock. Like, well, wow. So that apparently wasn't the hardest part of learning their job. And I feel like what's happened in sales with a lot of the playbooks that we're seeing is that they're so over focused on qualification that they're missing some of like the core elements. And obviously we're going to talk about that go into a great playbook, like the sales process and how do I show up? Like what's a real world example versus a fictitious way that I should handle some situations. So there's just a lot of opportunity for organizations as a part of this. So I'll kind of talk through for us, and Mel, you know, feel free to kind of jump in on any, you know, kind of place you want to add color. For us, there's really some key elements that go into every playbook. So for everyone out there, this will be the slide that, you know, you'll probably, like I said, we're going to record this so you can share this, but I think as we kind of get through it, this will be something I think that will help a lot of you tactically. So for us, there's a few things. One is the people stuff. You know, it's so funny. I talked to a woman, she worked at AT&T. This is like 20 years ago or something. Their onboarding process was like 3 months. And they had like a week about time management, 1 week about time management. And I think, again, when we think about a playbook, like you have people, for some reason, we just decided that people just should know everything already when they come to work for us, and how we sell, et cetera. So don't sleep on this, the people side. What's expected of me? How am I being measured? Like all of those things. What's my territory? Why is that important? Next, again, goes into the process. So we're going to talk a lot about the process piece. It's the stages. Hey, what are the steps in the process? It's how I show up. How do I message as a part of the process? examples of different, details, presentation decks, case studies, etc. Product, right? You saw on the last slide, or second to last slide, you saw product was one of the most important pieces. You would be shocked at how poor a lot of the product information is. Again, I see companies short circuiting and be like, well, maybe we need a sales engineer. It's like, no, you don't. Like, your stuff's not that complex. Instead, you just need to teach people how to talk about, the business outcomes and how that relates. And this is the one that I think most companies are missing, because guess what? To Mel, to your point, 5 years ago, you didn't need it. The technology was like Salesforce, Microsoft Dynamics, and Outlook, right? Like, that was the tech stack for a lot of people 7 to 8 years ago. Now, there's companies spending $1,500 to $2,000 per rep per month, and you spend this much time training them on it.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think, and I think what's interesting there is it's not just the reps. Like, we're even seeing, like, so we use Chorus internally for conversation intelligence. And the reality is, like, we're really not using even probably 20% of this functionality, because we're really using it as like more of a recording software where reps can go back, fast forward to the moments in time that, certain conversation was happening, and grab a snippet or go back and take calls. But I think that's where, hey, if we actually spent time training our managers on, like, okay, hey, here's what our skills playbook is, here's what our expectations are. Now, here's how we actually want you to use Chorus to be able to, like, incorporate that in how you manage your reps and coach them and make them more effective, right? I know we could be getting a ton more value. And that's something I'm focusing on long term, but I think that's just one thing that I'm spending a lot of time looking at. Like, as I look at our own spend, right, we're spending close to $900 per month per rep on our team on these different tools. Are we leveraging them to their full potential?
Totally.
What does really good look like? And frankly, even we have a lot to learn on what that is. And one piece there I want to touch on, the time management. I think, like, that could not be overemphasized. I'm so glad you brought that up, because especially now that people are remote, right? Like, if you look at how many folks, like, if you look at our SDR team, the majority of folks on that team are either career transition, right? We've got someone that's really successful, just blew through his quotas, but came from 10 years in restaurant management and joined as a BDR, and others for whom it's their first graduate job, right? The reality is, like, being an effective BDR, so much of that comes down to time management. Being effective rep, so much of that comes down to, like, do you have time set aside for account planning, for pipeline follow-up, for deal follow-up, for prospecting, for crafting and personalization? And we've, like, dedicated an entire day to pipeline gen, PG Mondays, but that's a huge part of it. And I think, like, that's something that we just overlook in the onboarding a lot of times. It's just, like, especially now that your reps and a lot of folks are remote, how do you, like, time management is more important than ever. And I just don't think a lot of people are spending enough time during that.
I love that.
In onboarding. So I'm just glad that you touched on that.
Yeah, it all fits. I think that's what a lot of people don't realize, but when you cram it all in at once, it's more difficult. So we did get a good question here. It was around length of onboarding. How long should onboarding be for a new rep? 4 weeks, 8 weeks? And what about quota ramp? This is such an it depends question. Like, it's like the poster child for it depends, because it depends on the complexity of it really depends on one thing, the complexity of your product, which hopefully then leads to, like, the average sales price. Meaning, like, if you have an enterprise, process, right, or an enterprise motion where your deals are long, it might take people longer to learn all the stakeholders. Wow, for this type of deal, these people have to be involved, these people. And so, I would say the standard for most companies is more like 2 weeks. Like, I would say that's, like, much more common. The number that we see is 2 weeks. I think what we're thinking about with a lot more companies is what makes sense to be onboarded now versus call it 60 days versus 120 days, etc. And again, a company I was talking to today, or actually, yesterday, that's the exact, they had a 4-week onboarding plan. And now we're kind of reimagining that to say, well, God, they're going to forget all the stuff they learned in week 2. So instead, what are the first parts? Well, the first part is these are reps that also generate their own meetings. So step 1 would be, like, what if we focus that? We tease out here's our sales process. We teach them the basics. But then at the 60-day mark, we kind of have another onboarding. And then at this mark, you have another. So I think we're seeing people take...
That's the transition.
Hypothetically, right? Like, because the process should evolve. If you're pumping thousands of people through a sales process, why isn't that process evolving once you have more data points? And that's kind of, our thoughts. So it depends is my answer. But I would try to think about not making your focus just on the first 4 to 8 weeks, make it on the first 6, 12, 18 months.
Yeah, I'd say I agree with you. It depends on the product complexity as well as the industry. I think it also depends on your segment. For example, we have SMB, mid-market, and enterprise. And so in parallel to that question that was asked about onboarding was also like quota ramp up times. And like, I can tell you for enterprise, for us, it's like a ramp over about 6 months.
Yeah.
Whereas SMB is only over like 4. And the rate percentages are quite different. And so happy to follow up with exactly those details. But I think that's a big nuance, is just if you have segments, obviously. Onboarding though, we are frankly still at the point where we're kind of onboarding all of our reps the same way. Now we're getting more sophisticated about breaking up that onboarding by segment as well. But we have about like 3 weeks of more structured onboarding where like there's very clear, we use our own tool for that. But it's a mix of kind of like live sessions with different leaders in the company, like our VP of marketing kind of does an overview on different things, as well as just your content on like your typical personas, motions, product training, et cetera. But we do an hour per week of ongoing training on different topics. And so I think that's just something to think about too, is just like, what is that like regular cadence that like plays in just as much to the regular onboarding too.
Yeah, and also your ramp is going to be directly impacted by the quality of your onboarding and your playbook. And so, by the way, in the universal sales is 3 months. Just so you know, what 90% of sales leaders, hey, what's a typical 3 months? It's totally arbitrary. It's totally BS. Each company, each product is different. But I will say again, if you're looking for areas of efficiency, and again, we're talking about the playbook, this is why the playbook matters, is that the playbook matters because it can shrink that time, when executed correctly as a part of it. So this is pretty great. Like, again, like I thought that this was like a positive. 70%, right, of top performers report their onboarding experience was good, right? So like, how do we, maybe Mel, this question for you, like, how do we juxtapose that, right? So it's like, so top performers, is it that, do they just need less? They just like, okay, like I got it, like it's okay. Or like, why do you think so many top performers, I guess, reported that their experience was good?
To be honest, I've got my personal hypotheses. I haven't actually like really dug into this with data.
Oh, that's all we're doing is opinions, right? We got some data, then our opinions. Like that's the goal.
But I would imagine like part of it too is just like raising your hand, right? Like I know that our top performers they are the loudest voices in the room when it comes to finding information, asking for help, et cetera. So I think there's a little bit of that like kind of self-selection process there throughout onboarding that definitely plays into it as well.
I think that's exactly it. That's what I would say too. The other thing that we do, and again, this one's a pretty like hands-on, like kind of very ugly version, but it's very tactical for all of you. Going back to time management, like one of the things we think that's really important for most playbooks is like, help me to understand how I should spend my time. Just help me. I can change this, right? And we encourage that when we work with teams, like we kind of customize this, but really encourage people. And Becca will drop the link here for you all to kind of check it out. But, we try to help them. Hey, if I'm a new rep, like how should I spend my time? Like I know what my old boss had. And so I think just sometimes I feel like we've got almost a culture at times where we're so scared of the term micromanagement that we also don't understand like the difference between providing guidance in some of that early on in someone's, time with us as well too. So we're going to transition. We're going to talk just a couple more pieces here. Mallory, love that. Glad it's resonating. So we will do a poll here real quick for all my folks on Zoom in particular. Let me see, is it already up there? There we go. Okay. So if you do that, hold on, let me launch it. Look at that. See, I got this down. Okay. So the poll choices for those of you who are not on Zoom are technology usage, scripts, day in the life, or other. So if you are not joining us, you're joining us on LinkedIn, feel free to just drop it in the comments. Technology use, scripting, day in the life, and KPIs or other. Oh, it's supposed to say usually missing, just FYI for everyone in the poll. I think people got it though, maybe, I don't know. Okay, there we go. Still a few more people chiming in. Day in the life, KPI seems to be the big winner. Technology usage is number 2. Just go ahead and end it. So here you go. So everyone should be able to see the results. So day in the life, 50% of people said that there was no talk of their day in the life, their KPIs. My friends, that's called expectation setting and what I'm supposed to do in my job. So it sounds like this people section for a lot of folks here could be of value. Technology was number 2. Scripting was number 3. So
I love
great.
that because I also feel like of all things, that's probably the lowest lift to go.
Oh, totally, right? Like that is probably the one that you could, you could do. So process.
Actually, on that note,
Yeah.
I'll try and find it afterwards, but the former CEO of Clearbit, the former CEO and founder of Clearbit, wrote a really good playbook. It's called the CEO playbook, I actually believe, but a whole section is on time management, and I think it's applicable across the board. So I'll try and follow up with a link to it, but
Love that.
that can be a good blueprint too on just how to organize your day and manage your time.
Love it. So Mel, talk about this stat.
So this one, so one of the things we're doing a lot of research on, frankly, because there's very little research out there, is just the pace of change within organizations, right? Because I think what we really want to get down to more than anything is really understanding like what is the pain that reps feel, right? Is it the fact that like, I think there's a lot of different factors, right? Is it the fact that managers aren't trained effectively and therefore they're not providing the right coaching? Is it that onboarding is lacking? Is it that they're somewhere in between go to market and product market fit, right? And so I feel like every organization is constantly looking to figure out like, how do we improve? How do we get better? And one of my hunches is actually just the pace of change, right?
Yeah.
And we see it frequently, like literally like 3 weeks ago, we announced our seismic, and I'm not trying to call Reese out if he's on this call, but one of my reps, so 3 weeks ago, we rolled out.
Well, you just used his name now.
Yeah,
So like now he's officially.
He's calling it. And I think like this example, but we just rolled out our seismic training. We had a deck, we had all of these like images and GIFs that we rolled out. And just like earlier this week, he posted in Slack, it's just like, hey, I created this GIF for seismic if anyone wants it for our integration. I'm like, hey, did you know that we have like this whole training? He's like, oh, thanks. This is awesome. Like, we just rolled it out, right? And the reality is like, it's not his fault that he forgot that we had all these resources available. It's that since then, 25 other things had happened in his day-to-day as a rep that have been going on. And we're actually in the process of kind of revamping and updating our sales methodology. And so I think the reality is that like, we are throwing out so many new things to our reps and to our teams that is just so hard to keep track of everything. And I think when it comes to process and sales methodology, like that's what that's referring to, is the fact that like sales leaders are recognizing the fact that like we are pushing a lot, but there's only so much the reps are absorbing.
Yeah, exactly. Process. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Again, like a lot of you said that this is kind of the basics of what's included. I'll call out like ICPs and buyer personas. I see it's kind of crazy. I see so many companies skip ahead to talk about like email messaging, and then the like, who is our buyer and what do they actually care about gets skipped over. If you all remember from the survey that Speckett did, the very first graph we showed you, right? What did people say was most important? It was understanding their industry and their buyers. So what I will say about process is just make sure that you include that. I'll just tell, when I started at Career Builder, this is mid 2000s, we got a binder that was, I swear to God, it was this thick. And it had all the industries like trends in manufacturing and this and this and this. Now like you could just use Google. They probably could have used Google back then too, but there's just, invest time here. Like when I tell people in process, the ROI you get from training your sales organization on trends in the buyer's world, what they care about, will pay off like at an amazing, amazing level. Similar to the day in the life, show people what the process looks like. It's like, again, it's like, I feel like so often you just kind of expect, or it's like I go and talk to Hank, and then Hank, I don't know if anybody's actually named Hank anymore, but I talk to like Hank, and like he tells me that this is what it is. Like help people to understand, what our process looks like at a high level. Buyer personas, call scripts. It sounds like people are doing that, which is great. As a part of their messaging and scripting. Like I said, we'll include a lot of this in the reporting.
And I think that visual example of a workflow, by the way, is often overlooked, right? So going back to this, like realizing that like different people just process learning and information different ways. Like literally science shows that some people are more visual learners, right? Something like this. Some people are more auditory, like walk me through the process. And I think like, if you haven't done this exercise for your own benefit, right, using a free tool like Lucidchart or something and just mapping out like what does that actual workflow look like will help you identify like what gaps you have in the process. Like, oh, we're expecting them to use outreach. We don't have the full sequences built out, right?
Exactly.
But it also helps someone understand like, oh, here's how I go about my tech stack in a much more kind of easy to consume way.
Exactly.
I see a lot of teams actually taking the time to do that.
All right, Scott. Scott asked a question. Lots of training, pitching on qualifying. I see most advanced sales do poor questioning. That would be built in here, which we would call this like messaging at each step, which is like how to run a proper discovery. And again, most of the discovery processes that we focus on are focused on understanding the individual and their team and who we're meeting with to understand kind of their day-to-day priorities at the departmental level, and then the more tactical. And what we see is a lot of these processes are just in messaging is more around the tactical, like, hey, great, what are you doing here? Do you have budget to change? Do you want it? As opposed to like, no, let's zoom out. Let's try to attach something we're doing to something bigger than just something more tactical. So Scott, I would see that live here to answer your question. Product overviews. This should be pretty straightforward for a lot of you. I'll call this one out feature to value matching guide. Okay, so we have demo best practices. By the way, I used to outlaw the word demo in my sales orgs. Like I just hate the word, but everyone uses it, so I kind of have to, because it's just it implies what so many buyers feel, which is I could literally copy and paste how you just explained this product to like your last 5 calls. And a demo, for a lot of people, they just kind of put it on autopilot, hit the greatest hits. The feature to value matching guide is something that says, hey, if someone talks about this, these are the features that solve that. When someone talks about this, this is how they solve that. And, whenever we work with teams, a lot of this is just training them like, look, forget the product. If before, whatever it is you want to talk about the product, you can't say, earlier in the conversation, you said this is how we're going to help you. Maybe you shouldn't be talking about it. And I think too often, again, because the discovery process is so poor as a part of this, that it ends up basically being a demo dump. And so for a lot of you out there, when you think about the product, think about how can you also help the reps to understand the product in terms of the outcomes that it provides, right? Or in terms of the solution that it is for a potential customer. So that is my piece there. Let's see. I saw someone raise their hand. I don't think we can bring people live. So Michael, you might want to just, or maybe you're just saying like, maybe he's doing like a double hand raise, like hallelujah or something like that. That's what I'm going to go with. But you can just drop your question in the Q&A if you had one, or you can DM either of us.
And just on that note, on the feature to value piece, like this is actually an area that we realized we were getting in like the feature demo trap. So not only are we kind of like rethinking, like how do we kind of unveil our product based on use cases and paint that value. So that's one exercise we did, but I actually sat down and documented 2 different kind of sets of things. One is like what we called a what we believe topic, which is just like, here are kind of like our fundamental philosophies or beliefs around like why we designed and built the product the way that we did. And like our view on like, for example, like one of our common things is like, people ask us all the time, like, are you guys a digital adoption platform, right? Because that's kind of the standard for technology adoption. I'm like, well, here's what that is. Here's what we are. And my view of the world is that like solving, like your goal should not be to drive adoption. Adoption will be the inevitable outcome that comes from you making your reps successful in their workflows and creating more value in those tools and the more time they spent. As a result, you look at adoption, right? And so some of those philosophies that like I speak to very easily on calls with our buyers and really help them understand, like, here's how we view the world and how we view like our product fit and the industry and some of those challenges and like those industry trends is a gap that I was just observing on our calls, like that kind of like thought leadership and that value selling. And so we spent time documenting those and we're doing training on that too. So I think like, it's not just like featuring value. It's also like, why? Like, why is this our approach? Because otherwise you're always going to get competing feature to feature. So
that's exactly right.
Software should have an opinion. That's what I want. I want our folks being able to really speak to like, here's why we think this. And I want that to be a cohesive narrative across all of our reps. And I think that's just part of the training we identified was missing.
Well, it's critical. I mean, that's before that, we call it worldview alignment, which is like, before we even talk about what we do, let's just talk about what's happening. Because candidly, if you don't believe that, me showing you is not going to work. So if again, so it's very similar, Mela, we think about it. It's like we talk about 3 high level trends and people are like, yeah. Then we talk about a big trend about like, this is what's getting ready to happen. It's like a challenger sale, value sale framework. So I love that. I really do. So this is tech stack overview. Again, we talked about this, everyone. Again, this is actually from, shout out to the folks at Hootsuite. In their playbook, they include all of this. They include like how they use their different technologies. Because again, you can't rely on the frontline manager to remember everything or to be an admin as a part of this. And I think a lot of you, I think this is the number two kind of most missed for a lot of you. So how confident are you in either your or your team's ability to use the tech stack? So let's hear a few ideas here of people and what we have here. So far, our friends at Very, they are the expert. So for those of you on LinkedIn, you got 3 choices: very, expert, somewhat, not at all. So those are your choices if you want to drop them in the comments. We'll let a few more people chime in and vote. All right. I'm going to end the poll now just for time's sake, and I'll share the results. Here we go. Nobody said expert. I mean, I thought maybe we'd sneak one in there. Again, we only use some tools, and it really varies across reps, and that's the punchline. Why? Like, why does it vary so much across reps? Like, why is that? Why does that happen? And again, it goes back to onboarding, that a lot of companies do not have a consistent way to onboard people to new tech, and also understanding, like, Mel talked about the type of people that she hires. How are they supposed to get up to speed? They've never even seen these tools. They were like in college to doing whatever, right? Or they were working at a restaurant. Like the lack of I think empathy that we have in onboarding for new hires around technology that didn't exist 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I just feels like such an amazing opportunity.
Well, and also just recognizing, I mean, my background was RevOps and enablement, and my whole idea for Spectre originally came because we'd rolled out Salesforce and it was just a disaster of initial rollout. And I'd never used Salesforce before, so that was definitely a big part of that. But the reality is, like, you've either got this generic help center content that may or may not apply to how you want your reps using it, or you're creating it all from scratch, right? And that's a huge pain point for teams. Just like the amount of work that it takes to actually train folks on your tech stack, like, it's a lot. And I don't think we've solved it. I don't think anyone's really solved that challenge. And it's only getting worse over time as, like, each vendor is launching new things every other quarter and providing more value, but you're only using this much of that value.
Exactly. So, all right, Mel, I want to turn it over to you here in a sec. I'm just going to go through a couple more things. I want to talk just a little bit about, kind of what much better looks like. Again, about half of people say, yeah, hey, it went well, right? Or like, hey, it went good to neutral to very poor to poor, right? Neutral to me is like I don't know. I almost put neutral in the poor. It's like neutral. You're like, nah, like it went like
NPS score is mediocre. You don't count it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So. You'd say that. I'll touch on this. This is our scaled sales transformation journey. My thought on this, and Mel's going to talk a lot more about it, is the linchpin to every good deployment is sales leadership. If enablement is trying to push it, it won't work on its own. If HR is trying to push it, it won't work on its own. And that the programs we see successful, we've got alignment and executive sponsorship. Not executives are like, yeah, that could be helpful. That will not help, right? And that frontline leaders actually go through it first, and they're part of the decision making. So for all of you who are wondering, like, how do I get better adoption, or how do I go about it? I'm just going to tell you, this is how I would think about it. That if your frontline leaders are the linchpin, but your exec leaders have to be bought in. We've never seen it work any other way. If exec leadership's not there, but even if frontline leadership or director or VP are bought in, but not senior, it'll still fail because they don't understand the why.
Just going back and, like, you have the reps there too. I think that's often overlooked as well. Like, make sure that your reps and you select some. And I think it's super important to make sure that you're highlighting both, like, your most tenured reps and loudest reps, where, like, everyone has those reps in their org. Like, they're the top performers. They've been at the company for forever. They have just a high degree of influence on the broader sales org, right? Because they've closed those big logos. Like, get them bought in, right? Because if
they have to be
that change and they're vocal in any way, shape, or form, like, that is going to be toxic on your ability to really drive that transformation. That's sales transformation, tool adoption. Like, it's all one and the same. Like, when it comes to change management, like, finding those folks on the ground that are going to be championing it, evangelizing it, and, like, be on board is so important, because if it's just top down, like you're just constantly going to be facing that friction. And I think that's one of the biggest steps that we see missed a lot whenever I ask, like, hey, do you guys have a subject matter expert group? Do you guys have a champions board? Like, that's usually where I get a little bit of blank stares. So.
Yeah, I love that, because people don't, right? It's like the people that are going to use it have to be brought along. I mean, that's just one of the biggest difference between sales change management and other change management is the importance. I mean, it's important in all of these, but it's even more important in sales, because again, salespeople have a lot of opinions, they have a lot of ideas, and if they're brought along, it goes really easy. Because guess what? Whenever you're doing the deployment, they're involved in the sessions and they're sharing stories from the field, and they feel like they put their thumbprint on it. And they did put their thumbprint on it. We've got a huge project right now, with a company that's doing $250 million. And, the step one for the playbook build is like, we're interviewing all the sales managers and like all the top performers, and just like, what are you doing? As opposed to starting from, this is the sales framework. And that's where I feel like command of the message and a whole bunch of sales frameworks fall flat, is they start from a place of rigidity and then try to bend, versus like, your people are already crushing it. Like, why not start from there on the best practices that we can replicate? So
on that note, actually, if you saw me look away, our VP of sales just walked in to grab his laptop that was in my office. And it reminded me of, like, just this morning, I was asking him, like, hey, I know we're rolling out our new demo flow next week. Can we connect on Friday just so that I can do a final walkthrough? He's like, hey, hold up. I talked to a couple of the reps and want to make sure that I run it by them and incorporate their feedback before we do the broader rollout, right? And I think that's just a perfect illustration of, like, let's get them bought in and feeling like it's theirs as well, so that it's not just like, hey, Mel wanted us to revisit the demo flow, or Andrew.
Exactly.
Demo flow.
Exactly. All right. So Mel, I'm going to turn this over to you just to kind of talk a little bit more about best practices. Again, I'll be monitoring the Q&A as a part of this. But let's talk a little bit about our last poll here, which is, what do you think is the biggest roadblock in Playbook adoption? So feel free, chime in. Last poll here. Let's see what people think. All right, we need some more votes here to make this statistically relevant. Technically, I think law of large numbers is like 30 or something like that as a part of this. So, all right, so I'm going to let this run. And then while it's running, let's see. All right, we got more people chiming in. All right, this is good. I like this last one on the question. It was a good one. All right, I'm going to close the poll now. We've got about 50% of people who chimed in. It's been a minute. So number one, skimmed over in onboarding. Don't really know how to use it. 52. Managers don't require it. 41. So everything, again, the details we just talked about here. My process and plays are better. I love that one person is like, obviously, like the biggest roadblock is like, I am, the woman or the man, and I know best. So I love that somebody put that as well too, but that's great. It could be though, maybe your onboarding sucks, and that's very, very likely. So again, hopefully from this, you've seen that this is kind of what we're seeing as well too. So Mel, I'll let you kind of take us home here, and, we'll wrap up here, everyone, in the next, 10, 15 or so. So I think it's hopefully, again, I'll still be monitoring the Q&A. So if you have questions, keep them coming.
Awesome. And this is really more of a teaser, by the way, for the presentation coming next week or next month, June 28th. We're really going to be talking about some of the strategies for adoption rolling out. And I'm actually glad that we asked that question, because I think we should probably dive in a little bit into how do we get managers driving more of that adoption and reinforcing it, and what are some ways that leadership can encourage that. But, one of the things that, not only inspired me to start Speckit, but that I'm also deeply passionate is just like adoption as a whole, right? And I think when it comes to playbooks and methodology, these kinds of investments where you are spending weeks, if not months, writing, strategizing, planning, doing discovery, figuring out like, what does your playbook look like, right? It is this massive initiative, or you're paying, not very cheap dollars for a level of expertise like the Jake Dunlaps of the world coming in and helping you figure that out. Like, how do you make that successful, right? And how do you make it consumable in a way that your reps will actually apply? And I think one of the issues is that most playbooks, right, are still delivered the same way they were 10 years ago. And so, Jake, I don't know, were you guys already doing consulting actually 10 years ago?
9 years ago. Yeah.
9 years ago. Okay.
9 years ago. Almost 10.
What was the format of your playbook delivery 9 years ago?
Oh, I mean, probably similar to today. It was probably PowerPoint and maybe some Google Drive.
right? Maybe an LMS if the customer has an LMS. And
Yep.
I just always think it's so perplexing when we think about that. It's just like, okay, so 9 years ago, this is how we were doing it. Yet today, we're still doing it the same way. Yet we're trying to evangelize to our reps all these new technologies they should be using to make their lives better, right? But the same enablement and the same guidance we're giving them is still the same way as we used to. And I think there's just a big opportunity here for us to look at. And frankly, one of the things we do is we actually help customers convert their playbooks. And I have seen 250-page sales playbooks, right? Like, what do we expect a rep to do with a 250-page playbook? How do we make that more consumable, more live? And that's really where our focus is, which is all about delivery, right? Because if you think about the day-to-day of a rep, they're probably sitting at home, right? Probably not with a pink background, but with their bedroom or something in the back. And their entire interaction on day-to-day is either Zoom or in one of these applications. And they're getting questions coming up all day, every day about your playbooks, right? Whether that's related to objection handling, whether that's related to pipeline management, right? And what those expectations are. And today, right, they're either going to a mix of, hey, did we learn about that during that rollout webinar during onboarding? Did we learn about that? Is it located somewhere in that 200-page sales playbook where I need to remember exactly what to control F? Otherwise, I'm going to be spending all this time looking for the actual answer, right? Is it located in Slack somewhere? And if so, what channel? How do I find it, right? Like, that is what the actual day-to-day of not only a new rep, but really a seasoned rep looks like when it comes to finding information. And so my whole view was like, hey, what if we could not just centralize that, but actually make that sales playbook content, the information they need while they're in that part of that sales process in whatever application they are, instantly accessible to them. And as we think about Playbook Rollout, I really think about kind of like 3 phases. The first one is like during the initial rollout, it's more of that structured rollout, right? That's when you're going to do what you mentioned, right? Hey, let's do the manager training. Let's get the champions on board.
Yep.
Then roll it out to all the individuals. Let's get like the CEO or a VP of sales to come in and do a kumbaya and get everyone excited about like this new way that we're doing. You're probably going to have some sort of an LMS course. You're going to have some documentation, some Zoom. It's going to be really carefully thought out. But the reality is like, that's not where you're going to see the results, right? The results are like what happens the 12 months following that sales playbook rollout. And that's really what comes down to the reinforcement. Say what? What were we talking about? Where's that information? And that's really where we're focused on, which is not just the structured piece, because I think there's a lot of solutions that do a really effective job of this piece, but more so, okay, now I remember that in this stage, there's something I should know and there's resources available to me. Where do I find that information? And now what, right? Okay, 6 months in, 90 days in, you launch a new product, you launch a new service, your sales playbook changed. You guys looked at your win-loss rate and saw that you guys were losing against competition. You're adapting how you compete, right? Changes are going to happen constantly. And so these are really the 2 focus areas that I spend the majority of my time, and what I've spent the majority of my time the last 5 years really thinking about, which is like, how do we actually drive that reinforcement? Because to your point, like whether it's the forgetting curve or whatever else you want to mention, people have such a limited amount of information they retain. Like even on this webinar, right? If we quiz, like, what was that first question we asked? We did 3 polls. What was the first question? I can't even tell you right now. I can't remember it, right? And I guarantee if we polled this group right now on what was the first question we asked, the answers would be mixed because it's just hard to remember all that information, yet we expect our reps to, right? And the same goes going back to onboarding, since that was something that came up a bunch. It's the same thing with onboarding, right? During the first 30 days, it's going to be super structured. You're going to have a whole plan. Eventually, you're going to have boot camps, get people excited. But the real results happen in the now, in the how, right? Okay, now I'm out of my structured onboarding. I'm on my own. I'm actually starting my prospecting. Now what? And then obviously your process has changed. So when I think about like playbook adoption, when I think about onboarding, the reason I use this slide is because I actually think there's a lot of similarities between like the mindset of how to actually drive that ongoing reinforcement. Okay, so let's talk about sales playbooks. So we know the current way, and that's largely focused on Google Docs. What I'm going to show is how we think about sales playbook reinforcement in the flow of work. Like that is like what our number 1 focus on is how do we bring that sales playbook front and center. So I'm going to start with our buddy Jake here. It could have been meta if I actually pulled up the webinar. But one way to think about it is like, okay,
I like that.
I'm an SDR. I'm in LinkedIn, right? What if my playbook was actually right here on how to go about doing prospecting? Right? So instead of a Google Doc, I'm actually learning how to do company research, right there. And what I'm supposed to be looking at, like, hey, on the insights tab, here's what you should be looking at. Do they have high growth? Is it lots of hiring and onboarding needs, right? Have they had a spike in their growth, right? Do they have any new hires in management that, you need to get buy-in? Next, go to jobs. Are there any recent job postings that are relevant, right? Like this is what, and I'm actually showing like real life examples of what I train our SDRs, or now our BDR managers, train them on, is here are the different indicators that you should be looking at when you're doing company research and trying to identify like what triggering events might be helpful in reaching out. And so that's really the way that we think about like that playbook, is just like, hey, they're actually in LinkedIn. Let's put the how to do research and identify account insights. Let's do the how to find prospects right there rather than elsewhere. Right. And then it's like, okay, great. Now you're going to go create a lead in Salesforce Lightning. Let's actually go there. So you can actually, go to that specific piece. You've got outreach. And so the whole idea is that workflow, right? It's not just how to use LinkedIn or how to use outreach or how to use Salesforce. It's here's how to go about from doing research on the account to creating the lead, to reaching out to them in outreach, so on and so forth, and really doing that playbook guidance right there. Another example is like if you're in Salesforce, right? We talked a lot about where qualification is not the only one, but I'm going to show this example because I think this is one that's just easy for everyone to consume, right? If I'm a rep and I'm trying to figure out like, hey, I'm in stage 1. I just got my first meeting. What is it that, like, how can I prepare as much as possible to make sure that that first call is successful, to make sure that my first meeting that I set actually goes on and gets qualified, right? Our whole goal is to put that same playbook information that you can have in that Google Doc right there front and center, right? So if I'm in stage 1 and I'm hovering over that here, I can actually click on stage 1 playbook and it's going to open up right here and say, hey, stage 1 objection handling, stage 1 call prep, stage 1 post first call resources to share, right? And you can actually see all the different resources that you can share afterwards, even our resources in Seismic, for example. So the whole idea is like putting that information front and center that reps need so that they don't need to go looking for the information, they can find it right there. We talked a little bit about metrics as well, right? And so, or medic or whatever it is, the reality is like, in my opinion, it's less what does M mean in metrics. It's more so if I'm a rep and I'm prepping for a call, what are some of the questions that I can ask to uncover these things, right? And that was one of the things that I think one of the questions came through, which is like, hey, it's not just the qualification, it's actually like later between qualifying and closing that a lot of trouble starts to happen in deals. And we actually see most of our deals get stalled right now in stage 3, which is the validation piece. That's all about making sure that you have the compelling event. You've got the ROI story, right? So again, if I'm a rep, like what are some questions that I can ask to uncover that information, right? Is there an ROI calculator that I might want to access in Seismic or Google Drive or somewhere that we can access it? So it's the same exact content, right? That could be in a Google Doc, but the whole idea is breaking it up and putting it in a format that's easy to consume and that can also be used during onboarding, right? So that same playbook that I was showing in LinkedIn can also be consumed in this format right here, which is, hey, I'm actually going to go read through this information at my own pace, in a very structured format. So these are just different ways to think about it from like more of a technology standpoint as we think about kind of the evolution of like, what does good sales playbook look like, which I think we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I think, Jake, you guys are best in class when it comes to that. But then also, how do we actually make it successful with the rollout? And so much of that has to do with the reinforcement. And that's the part of the process that we really are thinking about.
Yeah. Well, and again, that's why we're going to talk about the next piece, right? Which for everyone is, okay, we kind of teased out some of the ways to make sure it's effective. And by the way, amazing use. I don't think it's like, that's not clip art, like with the guy walking, but like, it was just a great transition use as well. I loved that. It was good because I like my eye followed. I'm like, okay, now we're here. So well done there. But no, I think that this is a big key. And just for everyone, just so you know, if you are on LinkedIn, we'll drop the link to register. If you are on Zoom right now, you actually got registered for both. So welcome, right? So you are actually automatically registered for the other one. If not, you can DM myself or Mel. Mel, let's wrap up. Feel free if people have some last minute questions here, closing thoughts here in terms of, your thoughts on where playbooks are going, if I'm building one or trying to optimize, any kind of final modern advice.
I think just like if there's ever been a time to actually focus on your sales playbook, it's now. Like if you're in technology, if you're in SaaS, if you're really in any industry that may or may not be getting affected by what's to come in the markets, right? Whether that's a downturn, recession, there is unfortunately a lot of different, terms around what's happening. Like the reality is like, you can't avoid it, right? And so what you can focus on is like, how do you make the staff that you have as effective as possible? How do you double down on your actual processes on getting this stuff right? Right. And I think that's just an area that I think hopefully this cool down a little bit in hiring is going to allow companies to center in and look at like, what do we know is really working, and let's codify it. Let's double down. Let's make it easier for everyone else in the company to be singing the same song. And I think that's really the way to think about it. I always say use the analogy like, hey, you can have as many cooks in the kitchen as you'd like, but if you don't have a recipe that everyone's following, you're going to end up with a lot of different ingredients, right? And you wouldn't do that at a restaurant. You wouldn't serve a general food item that looks different. Like, how are you tolerating that from your reps, right? Like, it's such a better experience if everyone on your team is saying the same story and has that guidebook around like how to actually do justice by your company, your product, and do a really good job for the buyer in helping facilitate that. So I really think of the sales playbook as less of like we have to go codify our process, but like, you are literally putting together something that is going to just bring ease and flow to your entire go-to-market motion. So
I love it. Yeah. Well, it's just understand that again, like you just got to eliminate all the variables. It's like saying just because someone went to the Culinary Institute, to your example, then they know how to cook this type of soup, right? Or something like that. And my engineering example of like, just because they wrote similar code at one place does not mean that's how you do it. I think for everyone, like definitely the next conversation, somebody asked about coaching to the playbook, and that'll be a big part of what we'll talk about there. So anonymous attendee, tune in. But I will say this is that you can have the best playbook, but again, if you're not bringing the sales team along for the ride, it's going to sit there and gather digital dust. And so for everyone out there, if you're thinking about redoing your playbook, or maybe you're trying to figure out how to get better adoption, I would really encourage you to kind of take a step back and say, okay, we're troubling with this. Could we go get a focus group? We use a term called Rapid, which is developed by Bain, or Racy is a familiar one. Can we go form a group around this that will help to bring more of the customer, and the customer in this case being our sales team, into the process. So I would just encourage everyone to go back and do that. We do have these downloads as well. Becca, I'm assuming we've dropped these into chat now. We'll share this in the deck too for everybody. So
well, yeah, I wanted to make sure we highlighted these because
I know, and Becca's like, somebody better pull that up right now, or like I'm gonna get a text message.
Yeah, but I think one of the part of the intimidation with creating a sales playbook is that blank canvas issue with like, where do I even go? And I think like that's where Skaled has done just an absolutely phenomenal job creating these templates. So highly recommend just leveraging and that's I think the beauty. Like, there's no need to reinvent the wheel, right? Like, don't reinvent the wheel when it comes to like what standard practices look like. Focus on like what's unique to your business, what's unique to your playbook, your products, your services, your worldview, your industry, and focus on getting that piece right. And I saw one of the questions come in, which was, can you dive in more into how to coach the playbook over time? Let's make sure we'll spend a good amount of time on that adoption webinar coming up on June 28th, specifically focus on that. I actually think we got a lot of ideas, Jake, that we can incorporate around like not just how to roll it out to the reps and how to like create excitement, engagement around it. But I think there's clearly something here about like how to make sure that managers are really incorporating that in the way that they work, right? Because at the end of the day, like this needs to be a habit change, a cultural change. So we'll make sure to touch on a lot of that.
Love it. Yeah. And maybe we'll add a little taste of like a sales leader onboarding, which, by the way, like, you should onboard your sales leaders. Pretty shocking, right? Like, it's pretty crazy how poor some of those programs are. So, all right, everybody. Mel, thank you so much. As always, I will see you. I think I'll see you in New York before I see you on the next webinar. But everyone else, really appreciate you tuning in. A few hundred people on LinkedIn, 50 or so people who are on Zoom, and we look forward to seeing you all in a few weeks on the next one. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.